And welcome to Arak Eskija Museum. We're very honored to have a very special guest today, Professor Dadoyan. She has been on my list, I have to admit, for the last 5 years. She is one of my heroes in the scholarly work as a woman and as a scholar. And finally, today came the moment. I know the timing is not right because it's April 24th is on the corner. There are a lot of events today, but this was the only time we were able to arrange for her to come in. But she promised that she's going to give another lecture, hopefully in a couple of weeks, on a different subject no one has touched upon. This is our 15th lecture in the last 4 months. So I was taking a break, but because Dr. Dadoyan said she's taking an extension, I'm going to make an exception because it's a subject that not too many Armenians have tapped upon. So, and then we'll announce it shortly. Now, I have flyers outside. There are a lot of events taking place the next 2 weeks. So help yourselves with the flyers. It's taking place in the Glendale Library at ARPA Institute. Professor Dadoyan is going to lecture at the ARPA Institute this coming Thursday at 7:30. So there are flyers out there, and I'm going to put you on my email list again. So please forward to your friends as well for those who couldn't come today, so they might be able to hear her. She's a dynamic speaker, and she should be recognized for her great work. Just to give you a brief overview of Dr. Dadoyan's accomplishments, she has a Doctor of Science in Philosophy. She was Professor of Cultural Studies, Philosophy, Art History of Technology, and Professional Ethics at the American University of Beirut, 1986 to 2005. Previously, she also taught at Haigazan University and the Lebanese American University. She was the Orjanian Visiting Professor of Armenian Studies at Milak of Columbia University. During the spring terms of 2002 and 2006, she was visiting professor at St. Nerses Armenian Seminary in New Rochelle, New York, 2007 to 2010, and at the Department of Near East Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. In the fall semester of 2011, she was invited as a visiting professor at Yerevan State University. The focus of her research and publications is the study of Armenian social, political, and intellectual cultures in their interactive aspects, both medieval and modern. In addition to many lectures in various universities and institutions, she is the author of over 50 extensive papers in scholarly journals in Armenian and English, and six books. Armenian Painting in Lebanon, Beirut, 1984, Pages of West Armenian Philosophy in Beirut, 1987, John of Yerzanjan, Sources of His Views from the Writings of Islamic Philosophers, Rashail Ihwan al-Safa, Beirut, 1991, The Armenian Catholico State from Cilicia to Antilles, Beirut, 2003, The Fatimid Armenians, Cultural and Political Interaction in the Near East, 1997. Her magnum opus is The Armenians in Medieval Islamic World, 4th, 14th Centuries, Paradigms of Cultural Political Interactions, which is going to be in 3 volumes. And we do have her books available for sale for you to sign. Dr. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And is this working?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much, and you're all welcome to this kind of strange time. So let's see what we can do. I'll try to read, this time. I don't usually read because I really want to keep myself on a clear and, slow track, because the ideas are kind of complicated, so I want to take this easy. It's one of the most complicated themes during the last month that I've been giving. Let's see what comes out. So my motto in this talk, and in my entire scholarship, I must say, is to be on top of the Armenian past, and not to be buried under it. This is a Buddhist wisdom, but applies so well to the Armenian condition, and during the month of April in particular. This is why I came up with this title, The Armenians and Islam, Images for a Brighter History of the Armenians. Not just because in the Armenian, April is a very dark month. It's a cruel month. So it's a different approach. They say that a letter is first read by its address. Let me explain my title. That is the title I'm proposing, Images for a Brighter History of the Armenians. Just 2 days before April 24. The timing of this talk is pure coincidence, but a lucky one at that. One must always make the best of the worst. This is what I have learned in my life. The contrast of darkness, as the Armenian April is, and brightness, as all things Armenian are. I believe things Armenian are not dark at all, they're quite bright. This contrast gives sharpness to our subject and gives us an occasion for reckoning and re-evaluation outside the traditional Armenian box. My main title, The Armenians and Islam, is a major subject for reconsideration, not only at this time of the year, that is April, but in general too. It is essentially an existential as well as an academic questioning about the Armenian condition for centuries. And at this junction, why? Why is it existential? One, Armenians lived among and under Muslims for almost 14 centuries, 1,400 years. Yet the genocide was committed by a Muslim state and Muslim peoples, and I mean especially the Kurds. But this is only superficially true and problematic at that. I try to explain why. Secondly, the modern Republic of Armenia is surrounded by three powerful Muslim states, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Iran. Thirdly, last but not least, at the present, the entire Near Eastern region and the world are caught up in the problem of an Islamic awakening of massive dimensions. But Armenians everywhere still do not quite understand the nature of political Islam. We haven't really researched that. We haven't tried to understand what political Islam is. By the way, there is also cultural Islam and there is street Islam, which is different. Each one is a different type of Islam. However, despite these facts and lags in our knowledge of our circumstances, the Armenian experience with Islam is not as dark as some have imagined and presented, nor it is as catastrophic and enframed by the genocide, that is, Islam and the genocide are usually connected, but they're not supposed to be, as marketed and invested upon. In other words, there are errors in our judgments and evaluations. In view of these points, my problematic, using the word in the French sense, my problematique, in other words, what am I concerned with, or my focal issue in this talk, and my entire intellectual career is the following. There are gaps and huge lags between the knowledge and images of the Armenians of themselves, I mean historical, literary, and folkloric representation, how we see ourselves, and the actual circumstances of the Armenians. There are lags. What we know doesn't quite correspond to what we are or have been. This is a problem. There are many ways to approach and discuss the situation. It's a very serious situation. In order to prove my observation, I will say that the question of Armenians and Islam is just one of the many paths of approaching this problem, trying to resolve why is it that our knowledge of ourselves does not correspond to our circumstances. There is a lag. I could write a history of Armenian social culture evolution, or I could write the history of Armenian arts and philosophy, as I have. My first book is on Armenian painting in Lebanon, the second one is on West Armenian philosophical thought, but that's not enough. Since history is the core of identity and the ground of Armenian scholarship, I believe that without history there is no scholarship. The basis is history. I dedicated the last 2 decades of my career, at least, to this particular issue, that is Armenians and Islam. I must add that I happen to have some advantages over others. My immediate environment in the Islamic Near East, I'm born in Aleppo, lived in Beirut. I'm from that world. My knowledge of the local languages and culture, that's automatic. To know Arabic, to know the culture, that's automatic, but that's an advantage, okay. Classical and modern Armenian I happen to know, not everybody will, but then I happen to know these languages. A philosophical and interdisciplinary training and career, and most importantly, a critical disposition and an appetite for questioning. You must have an appetite for questioning in order to get into this kind of issue. You must have an appetite for it, or disposition, and of course the courage. I soon realized that the subject of Armenians and Islam is not just an unasked question, but also a highway to a better understanding of the Armenian condition beyond traditional frameworks. It was a shortcut. I realized that very, very early. In other words, when I was a student, I realized that there is something wrong in the way things have been presented. I wasn't studying Armenian studies. I have never studied Armenian studies. I'm a philosophy student, so I just stumbled on some manuscripts or some stuff. There are many similar issues related to Armenian society, culture, politics, nature and everyday life. that escape attention. Analysis until someone poses a question. That is, you must ask a question first in order to start doing anything. The questions, that is the appetite for questions, may and may not find answers, but they definitely inaugurate new images and perspectives. And these are the rewards of the initiative, of asking questions. In other words, if we have been living in the Islamic world, or with Islam, for 1,400 years, isn't it time for us to ask, what is Islam? How did we cope? How did we survive? Or how did we coexist? How did we manage? We never asked the question. It never occurred to us. Basically, it doesn't seem so, because no one has ever busied themselves with the question of Armenians and Islam. Islam being what it is. Okay, why do I use the term, I'm still in my title, okay? Why do I use the term images and not another term? Because the term image, an image is a reflection. It is a depiction, but not a final word. An image is just an image. I may have 1 million images and each one is a different image. So to speak, it's not a dogmatic statement. And as such, it is a stimulus, it's a suggestion. When I look at the picture, it stimulates me to think differently. It suggests, but it doesn't say the final word. That's why I like the word images. Next, a sequence of images that I will give you in a while, or specific paradigms, I would rather use that word paradigm model of, of interaction, make an album of sorts. And they suggest a panorama, a continuum, a comprehensive story in snapshots. This is why I chose the word images, and this is what I'll be doing today. Now, I'll give you snapshots, one after another, so you'll get a kind of a sequence of images in your head. Maybe you'll change your mind about some ideas. The fourth point about my title is my suggestion to see a brighter Armenian history, as opposed to a tragic history of the Armenians. This is how we take Armenian history: tragic, dark, somber, morbid, or whatever. That's not so at all, as I see it. After years of research in Armenian social sciences and humanities, I've come to the conclusion that broader and less biased I approach is, the brighter the panorama will seem to us. Academically, this approach means adopting holistic and paradigm-based methods. Now, holistic means taking all the available data, well-documented data, from all possible sources. I should not dismiss anything that I don't like. I should not really decide what to take. I should take everything that's there. This is holistic. Like more or less like the Oriental yin and yang. In other words, there is no evil and good. It's basically one big, let's say, landscape. So you take everything that's there without, prejudgments, without exclusions, without ideological requirements. What doesn't correspond to my ideology, I will not refuse. I can't do that. I should take everything that's there. For example, the question of Muslim Armenians. You don't accept the idea, but it's there. You should take everything that's there. This is holistic. Of course, paradigm-based, I'll explain what that means. It means taking specific, well-documented cases and see if this happens, and if this can be generalized. It means I should not take my stories from the written narratives, but take cases that have happened, that have proved to have happened, and then start from there. If this has happened, then it does happen. Then let's see if it can be generalized, and it can change my mind about the way I have been judging things. For example, knowledge of this sort is the core of being an Armenian. In other words, holistic knowledge about Armenians, first, and for Armenologists foremost. In this respect, there are extremely essential questions I must pose to you. One, what and how much do average Armenians know about their history? The answer is negligible. Average Armenians, their knowledge is negligible. Because what most of us think that we know is either quasi-epic, in other words, mythical, or a second-hand account by somebody that has no truth or no interest. So we just don't care about that kind of knowledge. It has no validity. It says nothing to me as an Armenian. Secondly, since the genocide seems to be the central issue these days and all the time, by the way, most of our Armenian centers are dedicated to genocide issues, genocide/Holocaust. Does the little everyone knows about the genocide sum up the issue of historical self-knowledge? The answer is no. Knowing few things about the genocide does not sum up doesn't fulfill the requirements of knowledge that you should have as an Armenian. Does whatever knowledge most of us have about national history reflect their Armenianness, in quotation mark? The answer is again no. If national identity is primary knowledge of one's nation's history, both political and cultural, then how qualified is someone to be called an Armenian who is ignorant of her past, historical past? You're not qualified if you know nothing about your past. How can we define our Armenianness? Could there be degrees of intensity in one's awareness of their identity? Does a remote sense of ethnic background amount to history? The answer is no, of course. So we're nowhere. Knowledge is the core of identity, nothing else. I don't believe in remote, subconscious or unconscious senses of identity. That doesn't fulfill the requirement. Now, my book is a response to these questions. It's an individual response. These and many questions were the existential motives of my scholarship. And my work is a response, as I said, but most of all, it's an argument. My work stands as an argument against existing narratives or stories or accounts, or call it whatever you like. It's called the Armenians in the Medieval Islamic World, Paradigms of Interaction, 7th to 14th centuries. I start from the 4th century and go on to the 14th century, about the end of the Mongol period. So the theoretical status of my book is as important as the information it provides, and I'll explain to you how is it that my book can be a response to these questions of identity, of our condition, of the dilemma and of the crisis that we go through, hopefully, all of us, everywhere, even in Armenia, by the way. Armenians aren't free of the crisis. They're even deeper crisis than we are sometimes, but then we're all in crisis for various reasons. Now, as I mentioned, almost 1,400 years of Armenian life and experience with Islam has rarely, if ever, been posed as a separate theme or area in Armenian studies. Not even in Near Eastern studies. It should have been, but it's not. This study, my study, is in a way an inauguration of a new discipline in Armenian studies, but more importantly, in Near Eastern studies. We must have been in part of Near Eastern studies, but we are not. Because we have been there from the beginning. Before anybody was there, the Armenians were there. Before the Turks, before this and that, so we were there from the beginning. But how come we have almost been forgotten in Near Eastern studies? We're not there, basically. The scope of my book is much wider than the title. And my objective is to propose a different account of all things Armenian, not just our relation with Islam. The title is narrower than the book. It's usually like that. Because what is presented to the public as literature and tradition about Armenians does not answer the vital questions and fails to account for the conditions of the Armenians everywhere, in all circumstances, all corners of the world. They just don't. This study, therefore, is rooted in the Armenian condition, and it's grounded in a new historical epistemology. This is a new branch in philosophy. Historical epistemology means the way we understand history, the way we explain history, what do we find to be true and what we don't. For example, do I take the account of Yerishe about the Battle of Bartanant as a true one? It's the only one, by the way. How can I possibly take one source as a criterion of truth? I just can't do that. All history is nothing but text, and I do need several texts to put together, see what's happening. And then there's no archaeological proof either. So I have a problem. This is historical epistemology. It's a very new field in literature, in philosophical literature. What can be taken as true in historical texts? What can be accepted and what cannot be accepted? So I therefore suggest that we try to think of ourselves in historical context, not just because I'm an Armenian, in broader historical context, and decide what do we accept as credible information in the existing narratives, from medieval to modern. What is to be accepted, what is to be relied on, what it is not. Not everything that's written can be accepted. Very, very little of what's been written I take as acceptable. Most of it I personally don't, or find very, very highly doubtful, or emotional, or subjective. Anyway, so how do we use the information that's available to explain our past, to explain our identity, and to form images of ourselves that are relevant, modern, contemporary, and interesting? That's a task everyone has to do. Obviously, the theoretical status of my study is as important as the knowledge. In other words, I'm suggesting ways of approaching our history, what to accept, what not to accept, what is doubtful, what has to be reviewed and reconsidered. It's more important theoretically than what information I'm providing. That's important too. But then in everything, it's like, for example, a nutritionist, how does he help you basically? He may tell you to eat, he may give you a list of what to eat, but that's not the whole point. The point is to give you the principles, how to approach your diet. The principles, the way to approach food, for example, that's what he's supposed to teach. A good teacher is not the kind of teacher who gives you information. You'll forget that in let's say, a month. A good teacher is he who helps you think. He should teach you how to think, how to analyze, how to be critical. That's a good teacher. The rest will be forgotten anyway. So, as I said, the theoretical status of my book is as important as the knowledge it provides, and most of the knowledge is basically new, because in its inception, in its methods and objectives, I wrote the book as an argument for a different reading and writing of not only the Armenian experience with Islam, but Armenian history in general. That is my problem. As I mentioned, this position has its existential roots in the Armenian condition in the Near Eastern region, and in other words, if I hadn't felt a crisis where I was born, or where I lived, or the kind of education that was given or not given to me, I wouldn't have written this book. Anything, whatever you do in scholarship must be connected to your own existence. It should make sense to the point that, for example, if I hadn't known who my father was, probably the aim of my lab would have been to find the guy who was supposed to be my father. I must know where I come from, how to place myself, how the context I belong to, and how to react to these things. So these are very important. This is the idea. The existential roots of all literary work are what make that work significant or not so significant, basically. So as long as I exist, as I'm saying, in certain conditions, and as long as the images of the Armenian history provided to me or through the community did not correspond to reality, I wasn't happy. So I thought I must think. This is a reversal of the Cartesian or Descartes, I think, therefore I am. In other words, I exist, therefore I must think. If I exist in these circumstances, I must think to resolve or to understand my situation. This is how this book started. I mean, so it's not basically a book of history, but it's more a philosophy of Armenian culture, a philosophy about the Armenian condition more than anything else. So let me elaborate. Almost universally, being Armenian means having a mobile line of ethnic ancestry. My father's parents come from Iran, my mother's parents come from Cappadocia, I'm born in Aleppo, I mean, my children are born in Beirut, and now they're in the States. In other words, we have this mobile line of ethnic ancestry. We come from everywhere, and we may be anywhere. But then this ancestry is laden with centuries of narratives, story over story over story. We don't even know how these stories came about. So, and these stories come from the vast Armenian habitat. And that's another concept I have to explain. In other words, yes, there is the homeland, but there is also something called the habitat, which is very, very, very broad. And it has been from the beginning, we have lived all over the Near East. And we have, as you know, we have expanded all the way to Indonesia, Malaysia, the Oriental countries. And we have been in India, as everybody knows, Iran, the entire Near East, North Africa. And as of the 18th century, we expanded to Europe, and now beyond the ocean, that is North America and Americas. Now, there is something called the Armenian habitat, which is hundreds times bigger than the mainland, and we don't really think in those terms. Now, I do suggest another hypothesis in another book. I suggest the concept of the Armenian metapolis. There is an Armenian metapolis where Armenians live. It's a huge land. We should really, when I write the history of the Armenians, I should really consider all the Armenians everywhere, in all their activities, in all their belongings, religious or whatever. So we often forget that we are a nation that has lived on a very broad land for centuries, and we tend to talk about just the Republic or the mainland or the Hyrenic, as we call it, but then that's only 10% of our history. So we have missed most of our history, so we don't even have the paradigms to understand our historic experience. So the condition means carrying a heavy luggage of vaguely perceived legacies. People tell you, then you carry this luggage on your back without really understanding this luggage, epic stories. While we carry this luggage, we live in cosmopolitan networks of languages and culture. Look at yourself, where do you live? You live in a cosmopolitan area and you use all kinds of languages, but then on your back there is this luggage of misunderstood legacies or stories, which is a contradiction, which is a difficult situation to accept or bear, basically. So the condition itself is not problematic. But then again, I mean, I can say that I'm an American Armenian, right? There's no problem in this one. But then again, I must really come to terms with the legacies, the traditions, the narrow Armenian stories. I have to decide my relations with that. This is when the situation becomes problematic, because I haven't decided my relationship with this with the legacy, with this luggage that's on my back, or in my community. So, in other words, when I accept the narratives of these small Armenian enclosures, the small Armenian stories, then I won't even be able to understand my past. I cannot accept these stories, so I should really make up my mind and rethink about the stories that are given to me. This is the existential problem. This is the questioning that gives sense to all kinds of scholarship. Okay, so as I said, I must rethink, I must understand, in order to stand on top of my past and not be buried underneath. In other words, today, after 2 days, April 24th, we are almost buried under this date. We're not on top of our history, our past. We're not on top of the April 24th. We're not on top of anything. We're just buried under, because we allow the darkness. That is not true even. We allow it to overwhelm us. And we often don't even analyze, we don't even rethink the situation. We haven't even understood what happened yet. And how did we get to that situation? How did it happen? How many centuries prior to that things were happening and we didn't quite follow? And what is happening to them, we don't even understand that. So we have to do this exercise individually, this exercise of questioning, rethinking, reconsidering, and have the courage to reject all that is given to us and start all over from square one. This is the existential meaning of all kinds of thinking about our Armenianness or condition or whatever. So, this is a task. If you take it as a task, it does really require effort, extreme effort, to define or redefine, to create or recreate the historicity of the Armenian condition. I must place myself in historical context in such a way that it will make sense to me in relation to the historical background that I should be able to really understand. This is a task that does require courage to say what I don't agree with, or I reject, or I just find it impossible or unacceptable. And then I should do this on transnational levels. In other words, not because I'm a small Armenian in some corner of the world. As someone of the world, as a member of cosmopolitan society, with pride and dignity, and with optimism too. So one of the first realities to understand about Armenian history is that, this is a very important point, that Armenian history has never been monolithic. It is not a one single simple story. It has never been monolithic, but it's been presented as such. And it does not stand on a national, let's say, ideology, so to speak, in quotation marks. People have been writing about Armenian national ideology. Pure nonsense. There has never been an Armenian national ideology that you can trace or you understand. There's no such thing. I really dare anyone to tell me what is Armenian ideology. What is Armenian national ideology? It's a vacuous term. It may seem that makes sense, but it makes no sense because you cannot show it. In other words, I can show that there is a replica of the Zvart notes on my left, right? And you can all look at it and see, yes, it's true. There is a replica of the Zvart notes. But show me what is national ideology. No one can do that. No such thing exists. So let's not invest on vacuous phrases. Because in reality, there is no such thing. That's one. In other words, we do not have a simple story based on a morbid plot. Whatever histories you read, they're based on morbid plot. Sad stories, we keep being beaten up, we keep being massacred, and driven left and right. I mean, it's a sad story. There is no such simple story. because contradictory trends went into the making of Armenian history. Very contradictory, very unpredictable. Only we didn't bother to trace and bring out, see, this is how Armenians have survived, or this is what they have done. There are things you wouldn't like, but then that's how it happened, basically. So the images in most circulating narratives, mainstream histories, by the way, not any histories, people who have places in our scholarship, people you respect, but they all more or less tell the same story. I'm very sorry, but they told more or less the same story, more or less, not that different. So they fail to reflect the rich texture and the dynamics of the history of the Armenians everywhere, not here and there, everywhere. On all corners of the world, they fail to give this rich texture. They oversimplify and kill the story. And so you have this monotonous, dull story that has no interest. This is why our children, or my generation, we didn't like Armenian history. There's nothing fascinating. It's a sad, simple story that has no relevance, not even applicability, and says nothing to me. That's why most of us, we didn't quite like Armenian. I haven't taken Armenian history courses on any level, serious level, except elementary school. But then again, later on, would anybody go to a lecture on Armenian history? They won't, because it doesn't appeal. Lately, genocide has become this kind of attraction. People have been going to Armenian history lectures, but how many, the average age of any audience? How many young people have you seen that read Armenian history today? Does any young person buy a book on Armenian history? But then what we want is a movement, a change on a massive level. Because you need the mass to move. The minority doesn't move it. Because we're going to lose the mass. And that mass, in order to be saved, must really, we should present them a history that is appealing and attractive and meaningful as far as they're concerned personally, individually. See, it should appeal to the person. This is why I don't find that kind of history. The other thing is that where is Armenian history available? Where can one find easily accessible and exciting stuff on Armenians? Yeah, the internet is full. Everybody knows that. But then again, it should be on the real level, not the internet. So that's another issue, by the way, the issue of persistence and survival. That's another theme. We're talking theory now, essentially. Now, the Armenian experience everywhere has been too diverse and too complicated to correspond to simplistic constructs and ideologies. Simplistic. Most of our constructs are very, very simple. So, it is very difficult, as I was saying, to trace a constant line of Armenian policy or ideology or a strategy, except mobility and flexibility in the different communities and places that sustained the continuity of the whole for centuries. We're very mobile people, we're very flexible people, and that is what has saved us, not any ideology. People don't live with ideologies. I mean, common people don't go by ideologies. Never mind what the church says, never mind what the preachers say. People don't move by ideologies. People do by demands of survival, by demands of power, money. That's how people move, or personal interest. So we have had this kind of flexibility in the limbs that has saved the totality. So, and this has been the case for centuries. The communities everywhere evolved by the requirements of their own habitats. In other words, the Armenians of Lebanon have lived by the requirements of Lebanon. The Armenians of the US live by the requirements of the US. We have always been very local, and we have really absorbed the local identity too. The Armenian is a transparent person. We take the color of whatever we put. American Armenians are very much like Americans, aren't they? Americans in Egypt are like Egyptians. Americans of Lebanon are very much. So we take the color beneath and we adapt ourselves, and then we're very flexible. And if we don't like what's there, we just take off to a better place. This has been the case, you know. I'll give you some examples. For example, for a while there were 100,000 Armenians in 11th, 12th centuries in Egypt because the rulers were Armenians. I'll come to that. Muslim Armenians, the Fatimid Armenians. Then when the Ayyubids came and persecuted the Armenians, all they did is simply move and go to Cilicia. And they had a happy life there. Before that, they had come from another place under another Muslim Armenian ruler. I mean, we just keep moving whenever we find it, and that's how we prosper. That's how we survive. You're going to tell me that we lose as we move. We get assimilated as we, but then you have to pay a price for everything, aren't you? You're paying a price, but you're continuing, right? You're persisting. Never mind the numbers, but you're persisting as Armenians. Because you know, you're following an instinct of sorts, I would say. So the habitat is very important. People always forget this. To understand Armenian history, you have to understand the habitat in every situation. You have to know exactly the dates, where were they, how was the situation there, and how Armenians reacted to that. Otherwise, you'll never understand. To understand, let's say, the Lebanese Armenians, you have to know the history of Lebanon to see what happened to the Armenians in Lebanon. Or people have been writing, there's 3 or 4 books about the Armenians of America, right? This is part of American history, too, as much as this is part of Armenian history. So we have to suggest with force the paradigm of habitat. The Armenian habitat, it makes all the difference, where the Armenians are living at that particular moment. That's why we need to know the local history all the time. For example, the history of the Egyptian Armenians is part of Egyptian history. If I didn't know Egyptian history, I would never understand Armenian history, the Armenians of Egypt, for example. We fail to do this. One of the failures is missing the point of the habitat, the local politics and the idea that we always have belonged to the place we have lived in. Never mind the homeland, never mind the Hyrenic, so to speak. That's there, sometimes as a symbol, as an idea. But the habitat is what has made the difference, and the politics on that habitat. So the patterns in which we have interacted with our environment defy traditional concepts. And Armenian would not do this. Well, they do. They have. And we have this image of an Armenian in our heads. Actually, it's nothing. Nothing corresponds to that image. Armenians have and can do anything you can imagine. They can be good and evil at any point. So let's not come with, idealizations of Armenians. It just doesn't work. Because we're not the best of people. We're not the worst of people, but we're just people. We do what we have to do under the circumstances. So let's not be judgmental about things being good or bad, or we should have or should not have done this. So we should put aside our prejudgments. So, unfortunately, there are not many ways to reevaluate existing histories. People have written histories about that. You just cannot reevaluate because the past is gone. The past is not present. For example, if I were to rewrite, let's say, the history of Vartanants, this is an easy example. I can't do that. One, the Persians never wrote any history at that time. There is no Iranian account of the Vartanants battle. There is no Byzantine account of the Vartanants battle, because the Greeks were around too, right? There is only Yerishe, one source. I cannot verify history like this. And there are many episodes. For example, the history of Arzunis is written by Toma Arzuni, right? There is one major book, but not many references anywhere else. I should go to Arab sources. The history of the Bakradunis, for example. It's all, the historians were people who were in good terms with these houses. So, subjective stories. So, in other words, it's very, very difficult with modern understanding of history to verify the stories, the medieval stories, or any history for that matter. Even for the modern stories. I dare anyone to write the history of the Lebanese Civil War. Whoever writes it will probably take one aspect of it and then remain. There is this inherent subjectivity in writing history. History is nothing but text, and text is written by some person. So I just don't have objective criteria. So I must come up with my own judgment. I must use many. I should put all these sources on the table. I should try to see other evidence. I should try to come up with other processes. So it's very difficult today to verify the history of the Armenians, especially the Armenians. But then we should do our best. The idea is the following. We should not accept what is there as final and objective. That's the place to start. The minute I say I doubt, like the Cartesian, I doubt what is there, then I'm on the right track. And the minute I ask the question of truth, I ask the question of validity and objectivity, I'm on the right track. But the minute I say, for example, I was in Armenia about 3 months ago, and then I realized that there is this tendency today to take things on face value and en gros, as we call, en masse, for example. They do not want any criticism, any attempt to shed doubt on the existing stories. they have this, they feel comfortable in what is given, let's say, as traditions. Because getting out of tradition is dangerous. You wouldn't know which way to go. So it does take courage to say, all that is there is questionable, it's doubtful, let me start all over again. Maybe I'll end up at the same place, but that's irrelevant. The thing is to re-evaluate whatever is there. I mean, the 5th century historians have given us images of have started giving us images of the Armenian nation, then these ideas survived, and then the Armenian Renaissance, the awakening in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, preserved these ideas, and we haven't gone too far. By the way, in 1960s, the Soviet intellectuals started precisely where, let's say, Alishan had left off, or Aperian had left off. So we haven't really gone beyond. We haven't even checked how Western scholars think of history these days. It's not the same thing. It's like medicine. For example, today no one will operate on you without your MRI, right? But we do that today. We do accept things to be true, and without ever checking, without using the tools and instruments of contemporary scholarship. So these are problematic aspects of our situation, so to speak. Anyway, my initial argument in this historical rethinking, is the following. If historical Armenia, I read this on the other day, because this is a very, very powerful argument. I want your opinion on this. If historical Armenia, that is the homeland, I mean not quite, there is this idea of historical homeland, that is questionable too. Was it definable or not? If historical Armenia, as well as the modern republic, were always located between Central Asia Minor, that is, take this half, the Southern Caucasus, the Islamic world underneath, and if until a few decades ago, the entire region, this region, from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, to the Caspian, to Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Egypt, was the habitat of most of the Armenians, because during the past few decades people started moving, to the west. So their history, the history of the Armenians, must be, or is naturally, part of these locations and peoples. Because that's where we have lived, that's where we have been. And being what we are, we were constantly under this or that power, and sovereignty was a very rare thing in our case. So since history has no secret pockets and private laws, things Armenian are also part of the locations where the Armenians were, in the Near East or wherever, and must be studied as such, as part of the local context, the local historical social context. This has not been the case. We have always isolated things Armenian from everything else around them. That's our major mistake. Seeing things in isolation, as if we were different people. In other words, it's like physics. The law that lets the apple down, the Newtonian, the law of gravity, is the same that keeps the moon around the earth. It's the law of gravity. You cannot beat the law of gravity. So whatever laws were there in whatever places we lived in, they affected us. So our history should correspond to this situation. But it has not. We have written history as if we're exclusive, isolated people in some kind of glass box. We have to get out of this box that is basically made by nationalist historians. So there is richer and brighter history, more diverse history out there waiting for scholars of all areas to be studied, but it hasn't been studied. Many of the cases studied in brought up in my study are simply excavations. I have excavated cases from Arab sources, by the way, because there's more material in Arab sources than in Armenian sources. You know why? One, because Arabs have many historians, by the nature of their culture, and when they write about Armenians, they write about all of the Armenians that they have met everywhere. For example, historians of Egypt talk about Armenians. There you are. While we have nothing about the Armenians in Egypt, they have chapters and books about Armenians in Egypt. There are histories of Armenians in North Africa, a history of Armenians in Mesopotamia or contemporary Iraq, or Iran for that matter, or the historians of Syria. There are three major historians, Arab historians of Syria. If you only extract the passages about Armenians and collect them together, you will have several volumes. Just about Armenians. When they say Armeni, it's like Arabic. In other words, he's an Armenian. He can be anywhere, he can be anything, he can live anywhere. In other words, they don't define the Armenians by their homeland. They define the Armenian just like, an Armenian. He could be Muslim, he could be anything. He could be Chalcedonian, he could be Catholic, he could be Protestant, he could be anything. So they talk about Armenians as if they were one of the region. They don't single the Armenians out of the texture, so that gives them a wide margin to talk about all the Armenians, and with no bias, by the way, with no prejudice. They take them as part of the society, and they have really played extremely important roles. 200 years we have been in North Syria. In Aleppo, 12th century, for example, there were 6 churches and 1 mosque. So, and then in Egypt we ruled 100 years. Absolute Armenian rule, the entire army was Armenian, Egypt, from 1074 to 1170s. Who has talked about this? My other book is The Fatimid Armenians, was an eye-opener, that we have been everywhere. We haven't been isolated people. We have been so many generals in Arab armies, and very, very important generals. So it's a very bright history. What is the problem with us? And these are Islamic societies, aren't they? And by the way, the reason why the Turks, the genocide basically, was not for religious reasons. Everybody knows that. It's because of Turkish nationalism and political agendas. Not because of religion, not because of their fanaticism. The religion is a facade. The religion and politics in the Middle East cannot be distinguishable. They cannot be. Today, can you distinguish religion from politics? Anywhere in the Middle East. I'm talking about Shiaism in Iran, I'm talking about Sunnism, and then just think about the situation in Syria. What are the inner causes? What are the actual causes of this situation? Then you can realize religion and politics cannot be separated in the Middle East. They're very, very closely connected. Anyway, if you have any, I can go on if you have patience. I can talk a few things about volume 1, volume 2. I mean, what is it that I'm arguing for? What are these images? For example, in volume 1, I'm taking up this following idea, that the factors that controlled or conditioned our relation with the Muslims, the Muslim armies arrived in Armenia around 640, okay? As of 640s, we call this area the beginning of the Arab period in Armenia, right? In Armenian histories, they finished this period by the rise of the first Bakraduni king in 884. And they say this is how the Arab period finished. Absolutely wrong. So point 1, when a king rises, I mean, the Bagraduni king was not absolutely a sovereign king. Everybody knows that, because he was between the Islamic Empire and the Byzantine Empire, right, between 2 superpowers. And he wasn't really a completely independent sovereign king because of the situation. And we have always been in this situation. So I'm saying that there are factors in Armenian history that must be understood independent of small events. The factors of being between East and West, 1. The factors of what is national loyalty, what is the Armenian nation, these ideas, what is Armenian orthodoxy, religious and national. There are factors. And then what about, were Armenians always one mass, or were there levels of politics? I mean, were there groups of people who didn't agree with the establishment, with the church, with the nobility? So these factors were there. When the Arabs came, they simply continued. We just didn't bother to understand the factors that affect Armenian politics or Armenian history. And we miss many, many interesting pockets. So in this volume, I'm presenting new ideas about classification. The Arab period did not end in 884. If one Bakraduni king, actually, the word Malik in Arabic doesn't quite mean sovereign king. Malik also means lord, master. So he wasn't a 100% king. So the word Malik shouldn't confuse us, or we shouldn't really consider the Bakradunis as a completely sovereign, independent kingdom. That wasn't the case. Nor the Arzunis, nor the Sunnis, and all these kingdoms rose by Arab help and encouragement, by the way. The Arabs helped, or otherwise they wouldn't have been there, because they wouldn't dare be. They wouldn't dare to declare some kind of dynastic power there. So I'm trying to shed light on kind of nationalistic histories. I mean, talking about the Bakraduni kingdom, how glorified it was, or the Sunnis or the Arzunis. These are just dynastic territories, and then we have to see these 3 territories under the light of how were they looked upon by the Greeks, the Byzantines, or by the Arabs, or the local other powers. And then eventually when the Crusaders came much, much later, how was the situation? What did sovereignty mean in the case of Armenians? When we lost it, what happened? We don't really think in those, the broader terms, the interactions. So these are some of the discussions, classifications. Arab sources are absolutely important to understand Armenian history of all these dynastic powers, the Arzunis, the Sunnis, or the Bakradunis, and the lesser. By the way, there are many lesser kingdoms too, so to speak, at that time. It was between the Islamic state and the Armenian, let's say, the Armenians. He was the prince of princes, or the governor of Armenia. I'm trying to show that the protocol, it's a protocol, it's the first one that we have, and it's the only one that is authentic, by the way. No other protocol has been preserved. I mean, the writing, the actual text. This is the one that exists, and it exists in the same way in other sources too, in Arabic sources. I'm saying that the agreement of 652, there was another one in 64, is not the first one. We think it was. Actually, it was not. During the lifetime of the Prophet, actually, you know that the Prophet Muhammad went from Mecca to Medina in the year 622. This is the year of Islam. 622 is the first year of Hijrah. That is Islamic calendar, okay? So he stayed in Medina, a city about 400 kilometers north of Mecca, about 10 years. He died in 632. So there are records, not Armenian and of course local, that in the lifetime of the Prophet, probably in 624, that's 2 years after he was in Medina, Armenians went there and asked, Armenians of Jerusalem went there and asked for a kind of a guarantee for their estate, because they knew something was happening, the region was undergoing change, and there was this contact. By the way, many messengers went to, they tried to contact the Prophet, and how are we going to agree about things? The Jews did that. Actually, Medina was inhabited by 3 Jewish big tribes, which later on did not convert to Islam, and they were all massacred. It's a long story. But as of 624, to the end of his life, Prophet's life, about 3 months before he died, 632, Armenians have been going back and forth to Medina and carrying on talks. The idea is the following: the Armenians be in control of all the religious states or the properties of the churches in Jerusalem as the leading church. Later on, and they have been given promises and oaths. These oaths have been recorded, but the papers, of course, cannot be found. So in other words, the Armenian the protocols with Islam, or the relations, started much earlier, and the thing is not that simply. 652, 654, and then it went on in the early 8th, just before the 8th century. And then in the early 8th century, Hovannes Olsenti in 719 went to Damascus, right, to the Umayyads. And then all the pacts were based on the first one. And every pact says, this is a renewal of the pact with the Prophet. And the Armenians, there's a literary tradition among Armenians that the Prophet Muhammad gave an oath to the Armenians, the oath of the Prophet. And this is recognized. Salah ad-Din in 1187, he conquered Jerusalem and took it from the Crusaders in 1187. Has this big oath or treaty given to the Christians of Jerusalem, but addressed to the Armenians of Jerusalem, and then he repeats every single one of these oaths in his own letter, and this letter is authentic. It's kept. It's one of the most authentic texts that we have today of the time. So he simply establishes the Armenian special relationship with the Prophet. So this shows some kind of foresight, some kind of shrewdness at the time to deal with this man, with this Prophet, and then come to terms, and then have some kind of a promise. At the end of the 14th century, Grigor Datevati goes back to this Prophet, the oath of the Prophet. He says, see, your Prophet has given us an oath, you have to respect that oath. And they brought it up every time. In the early 17th century, when Shah Abbas brought Armenians from the north and established the city of New Julfa, it is said that there was a copy of a letter of the Prophet, of these letters, that was kept in Salamiya in central Syria, and a copy of it was brought to New Julfa, and on the basis of on what terms Armenians will deal with the Islamic State were respected, and then a promise was given to the Armenians of New Julfa, and that these are the basis of our relationship. In other words, there's a story there's a protocol between Armenians and the Islamic State. Later on, the millet system of the 19th century, in the Ottoman millet system, is very much based on the basic Islamic oath to the dhimmis, or the non-Muslims of the Islamic States. We really don't understand Islam to understand how does Islam look at non-Muslims, the weaker states, or people under their force. we haven't really understood the situation. Modern Armenia is surrounded by 3 Islamic states, and I wonder if, people in positions today, both in the Republic and outside, have really bothered to understand what is it to live with Muslims. How do Muslims look at non-Muslim states? There's a failure. There's a failure in understanding historical context. And then there's another paradigm I've just mentioned, that there has been a borderland situation in history, in Armenian history. In other words, there has been a very, very broad belt from the Black Sea, Trebizond, all the way down to Antioch. A very large area between the two empires. It has been a no man's land. Most of our so-called Polish and Tondragian history only belongs to that area. In other words, we have had factions, people, Tondragians and Policians fighting the Byzantine side, and on the Byzantine side we have had Armenians in the eastern armies of Byzantium fighting with other Armenians on the other side, some of whom were Muslims, some of whom were Chalcedonians. In other words, we have had a whole political career on a very broad area that has no record. We have no record of these times, and I can give those times. Osneti talks about it. From the early 8th century, that is 720s, 30s, to I would say to the Turkish period, the fall of Manasgirt in 1071, that's when the Turkish Seljuk period starts. There is this very broad belt. There's so much activity there that we haven't even talked about. We have fragments of information, like Grigor Magistros talking about his persecution of the Tondrakians, right? He has so many epistles, letters, There's this kind of fragment information, but otherwise we have no information. Arabs talk about Armenians being there. For example, one historian talks about an Armenian general being there, and then there's another Polician Armenian fighting with those Muslim leaders, and then on the other side there are other Armenians on the side of the Greeks fighting these Armenians. What is going on? What kind of career have we had that we have no knowledge of? Because it doesn't correspond to our ideals, and Armenian is supposed to be attached to the institutions of the church and the nobility. What if he's outside it? Have we ever talked about extra-establishment Armenian history? And there's so much of it, and a broad history that we haven't touched upon. So all Armenian history is not Orthodox Armenian history, in other words, attached to the church. For example, as I was talking the other day, if I wanted to write the history of Armenian Christianity, should I take in the Christians that have not agreed with the church? Or they have had their own idea of Christianity, and we have called them the sect, and we have simply excluded them. As of the 4th century, we have had a whole level of Armenian history that we haven't touched upon, because that's not Orthodox Armenian history. See how poor, how impoverished history gets when you start cutting down stuff that you don't like, that doesn't fit your criteria. See, that's how the bias and subjectivity, so, and it's still continuing, for God's sake. Do you think what my books will be part of Armenian classical literature? It's problematic, it's questionable, but doesn't matter, because even if I confuse people, uncertainty is a shield against dogmatism. The less you insist on your ideas, the less dogmatic you are. The more hope there is for you. The less you close yourself in, the more you will be advanced or promoted. Anyway, volume 2 that's coming up in November is really maybe the most controversial. I'm talking about Armenian realpolitik. Realpolitik means politics with no principles, no ideology. In other words, I do what is necessary at this time. No principles, no ideologies, no constraints. I describe our politics of the late, let's say, 970s to the rise of the first Cilician king. In other words, 1198. Levon, actually he should be second, or Levon the first. Anyway, 1198. This period of 200 years, I'm saying that this is a distinct phase in Armenian history outside the homeland. For the very first time, as of the year 1000, actually early on in 970s, have you heard of Tzimiskes, or Hovannes Chimishkik as we call him? He started bringing up Armenians all the way to Syria and inhabited them in the Orontes Valley, that is the river, and the entire North Syria, by the way. And for a while, North Syria for 200 years was predominantly Armenian. including the cities of Antioch, the neighboring cities, Aleppo, and then east of this area. Actually, the Pahlavunis were given lands in Manbij, which is right next to Aleppo. So we have really inhabited this whole area, and then we haven't been just there, we have ruled there. So for 200 years, there have been at least 14 Armenian enclaves, principalities in this area. In other words, I'm saying that the loss of sovereignty, we started losing our kingdoms as of the year 1000. The kingdom of Dyke, for example, started falling. Arzunis fell in 1021. The Bakradunis fell in 1045. Eventually they're all going to fall because Byzantium is going to annex everything Armenian to the empire and then open the land, and then that's how the Seljuk Turks got in, because the owners of the land had left. Once you take the Armenians out, you're opening the land before the Turks who started coming in as of the 1035s, 1030s, 40s. When they removed the Armenians and then took their nobility to the west, for example, the Pahlavunis were given lands in Cappadocia and North Syria, so they got out of the mainland, and that is their traditional mainland. The same is true of the others. So when they moved the Armenian nobility, they opened the land, and the Seljuks got in very easily. So that was a huge mistake that changed the face of the region. Byzantium has made mistake after mistake, and they have never really succeeded. They tried to make us Chalcedonian, they failed in that. They tried to expand into the entire Asia Minor, they failed. It's one failure after another at that particular time. So 200 years, we have been there. I can give you the names of 14 enclaves, territorial principalities. By the way, the Rubinian barony or principality that was more or less established in 1080 is part of this move. Armenians moving out of their mainland and spreading in the region. You know what happened? What happened was not this dark situation that Armenian historians talk about. Absolutely not. Power was redistributed. So political energy broke down into pieces in the entire region, and then suddenly you have all these principalities and kingdoms. So it's not our dark ages, it's our bright ages. So we became the owners and the rulers in a very big area over Muslim peoples. And then we also provided safe havens for our people. Have we ever looked at this period of 200 years as a separate phase? No. So this is not just a matter of classification, this is a matter of approaching situations. So I can give you these names, and then also, for example, I can give you another example that is still an obscurity. From the year 1060, 1060 to the year 1080, Turks were expanding, and then they got as far as Cappadocia, so on and so forth. In these 20 years, right, 1060 to 1080, I'll give you 5 Muslim Armenian territories. 5. The Danish Mandits in Cappadocia. Everybody knows that they are Georgian Armenians, right? There are the Banu Boğusaks in the city of Sevaverag or Severek on the river Euphrates. There is Philaretus, who converted to Islam, the renegade, the famous Pilardos Haye or the Philaretus. And then there is the Abbad family that established a kingdom in Palestine, okay? And there are the Fatimid Armenians who ruled there for 100 years. 5 Muslim Armenian powers established in 20 years. Has anybody noticed what's happening? Why did they convert to Islam? Because if they hadn't, they would never have been able to rule. In other words, have rights over territories, because we live in the Islamic world. It's a Turkish word, but it's Islamic. It was Arabic, it was Islamic. So the conversions were political conversions to Islam in order to rule. And they did manage to rule. And when they ruled, for example, when Badr Jamali, Bedrosov, he probably was Bedros, I discovered that he was from Aleppo. By the way, the governor of Aleppo from the year 1016 to 1021 was an Armenian called Aziz. Okay? Aziz was an Armenian, supposed to be a Muslim. But what does this Aziz do? The eve of Christmas, the 5th of January, so he wasn't a Chalcedonian, he was an Orthodox Armenian. He used to light up the castle, the fortress of Aleppo, everybody has seen the citadel of Aleppo, celebrating Christmas. Now, what kind of a Muslim is he celebrating Christmas? And then he imposed his ethnic identity. Every single Armenian figure, Muslim Armenian figure, in these 200-300 years, every single one of them had the Armeni after his name. 200-300 years in the Islamic world, converted families, they keep the name Armeni. And no one can really offend them on that basis, because that's not a good choice. They were very much aware of their identity, no language, no religion. What keeps an Armenian in an Islamic world, in an Islamic machine? I mean, Just think. Just think about ways of dealing with in a strange world, of a strange religion, whatever. Anyway, so this is a fact of history. Not a word in Armenian history is about the Islamic powers. Not one word. Except Matthew Surhayeti, Matthew of Edessa. He has 2 paragraphs, small one. One about Grigor Vgayasev, the son of Grigor Makisros, visiting Egypt in the year 1073, 4, 6, then stayed there till 78. Another small paragraph about the Danishmand in Caesarea and Sivas. Only 2 small paragraphs. While if you open Arab histories, there are hundreds of pages on Armenians doing this, doing that, going there, going there. I mean, so it's there. Anyway, volume 2, I'm taking the other major paradigm, that cosmopolitanism. There is something called medieval cosmopolitanism. And Armenians feeling as part of that world, especially 13th, 14th centuries. The cultures in the cities, societies were mixed. Armenians had no scruples. We have taken so much of Arab sciences, medicine, technology, everything, and adopted as if it were ours without ever having problems with how to adopt an Islamic policy to ours. For example, there were these coalitions of young men in cities. They were called the Futuwa in the Arabic world. And in our case, they were called the Manuks or Yekhbayluchun, you know. They were brotherhoods in cities, so, you know, kind of chaotic, extra-ethnic, extra-religious, so on and so forth. They were so chaotic that, the Caliph came up with a reform program for them in order to reform the youth of Baghdad, you know, because they were all over the place in the cities of the Near East. And our famous Hovannes Yerzangati of Yerzanga, he was a Bartabed actually. He takes Al-Nasser's program of reform and literally changing the name of Muhammad with Christ and then adapted to the Armenian condition. And then there we have the Yerzangai Yekhbartsmi Changanunatrutuna, written in 1280 for the youth brotherhoods of Yerzanga. And this text becomes a reference, not just there, to the end of the 19th century in the East European Armenian diasporas. I can give you about 20 such texts based on the text of Yerzangati, which is taken literally from an Islamic text. There we are. So this sort of thing is very, very, you know, disturbing in some senses when you realize that there are things that so many things that you don't know. Finally, in volume 3, I'm talking about the image of Islam and the Prophet in Armenian literature, and the very first time, I'll just conclude, the very first time Armenians refer to Islam as a religion, as a competitive religion, is after 750 years of Islam. 750 years takes us in order to react to Islam and give our opinion about Islam. So these 2 texts are again studied for the very first time. That's how I finished this thing. I stopped at the 14th century. The next period is Ottoman period. That's another thing. It could be another project, but then that's where I stop. Okay, thank you very much for your patience.